So when you're talking to couples, married couples, Song of Solomon, unmarried couples, okay, how far is too far, all that kind of stuff. There are things that it's good. What about people who aren't in a relationship? What about people who are single or single again? What about your kids who are just starting to discover their sexuality? What about people who experience sexual urges, sexual temptations that are different, that are not, even in their ideal, they're not what God desires in terms of male-female relationships, same-sex attraction, multiple partner attraction, sexual addiction, fetishes, all of these kind of things. What about that? The industry, the pornography industry around the world feeds off of that. It exists because of that. Pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry because sexual fantasy and sexual urgings and sexual longing and even twisting of those sexual, even what should have been seen as good, being twisted and being turned and used as power or a form of degradation or a form of control or all of this. I mean, don't do it, but you just 5 minutes on the internet and you can see the absolute worst of human nature when it comes to sexuality. If there's something you can do sexually that's awful, not only has someone done it, but they've probably made a website for it. That's how bad it is. Now, the good news is that's nothing new. That's just, we'll see in a while. But for a lot of people, the question that they have, especially for younger people, is, all right, so what about like sex without somebody? What about masturbation? Like nobody wants to say the word because it's so embarrassing. It's such a weird word. But what about it? What does the Bible say about it? What does it not say about it? How, as a Christian, should we approach this issue? This is the dreaded conversation for most parents, that you don't want to have this talk with your kid. If you do, you use euphemisms, you use figures of speech, you use all this stuff, but it's a real issue. It's a very foundational sexual issue, and it's the way most people in America experience their sexual outlet through sex acts not involving other people. These are pre-internet statistics. So before the ease of the internet, before you could literally have the equivalent of an adult video store on your phone, this was the case. So if anything, it's going to be even more today. One survey of evangelicals. These are evangelicals, Bible-believing, conservative to fundamentalist, somewhere in that spectrum. Not liberal, like, well, the Bible's just a good book, but I live my life according to whatever. Not churchgoers, evangelical Christians. 31% of lay people and 30% of pastors considered masturbation to be wrong. 32% of lay people, 35% of pastors said it wasn't wrong. And the remainder said it depends on the circumstances. So just among evangelical Christians, there's a spectrum of views on the issues surrounding and involving masturbation. In other words, when you say, well, what does the Bible say? What's the biblical teaching? Well, that's a trickier question than you may have ever been led to believe. In a 1987 survey by Christianity Today Institute, and CT is a flagship evangelical magazine, 47% of pastors and 35% of Christianity Today readers reported that they masturbated at least once a month or more often. Upwards of 70% of male college students in Christian colleges who struggle with spiritual conflicts are actually referring to or facing the issue of masturbation. And if you've ever done ministry, I did ministry for a couple of years with college students, and particularly college guys, and that was the number one issue. If you wanted to get to the heart of just uncomfortableness, that was the issue that did it. Everybody would dance around the subject of, I'm struggling with lust, my spiritual life, habitual sin. They do everything they could to not say, I can't stop masturbating. Because just saying that out loud was so awkward. It was so weird. They could tell you all about how they got tore up drunk the other night. They could tell you about how they had sex with their girlfriend or their boyfriend and were ashamed of it, but there was still kind of a bragging, right? Like a confession brag. Like, yeah, I used to be in a gang. I used to kill people. I used to shoot up heroin right into my eyeball and then go out and rob a bank. That's not confession. You started bragging. You started building up your testimony to make it, right? Like there's a coolness about some sins. There's no coolness about, yeah, I sat in my dorm room on my laptop and looked at pornography all night and masturbated. That's not cool. That doesn't make anyone go, oh, God's grace is amazing in your life because you don't do that anymore. That's the point. Like, it's just such a, it's weird. The lights are dim. I can't see who's blushing or not, but probably the fact of just saying the word masturbation makes some of you uncomfortable. And it's okay. I mean, that's just our culture, but it's nothing new. Here's one thing to think about. Nothing new. Egyptian Book of the Dead, all right? So this is an ancient text that contains the incantations and rituals that you would do on behalf of the dead, or if you were facing death, if you were wanting to assure that in the afterlife you had more white marbles in your balance than black marbles. White marbles, good deeds, black marbles, bad deeds, weighed in the scales, and if your good deeds outweighed your bad deeds, you enjoy bliss in the afterlife with the gods. If not, you'd experience all kinds of stuff. So there was this in the ancient cultures. This is like around ancient Old Testament times. In one of the Book of the Dead chapters, chapter 125, it gives a list of things that you're supposed to say or promise that you haven't done to show that you're a holy and righteous person. And so among the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were crazy sexually promiscuous in terms of, or not promiscuous isn't the right word, sexually debauched in terms of their behavior. I mean, they did all kinds of stuff and even celebrated all kinds of stuff. But part of the oath was, I have not harmed the offering loaves of the gods. I've not taken the festival loaves of the blessed dead. So they've kept their religious practices. I have not penetrated the penetrator of a penetrator. That has to do with sex and homosexuality, and that's just how they word it. It's like an inception, like the penetrator of a penetrator of a penetrator. But what they're basically saying is, I haven't engaged in male homosexual acts. I have not masturbated. Just right there. I haven't done that. I've not reduced the measuring vessel. I've not reduced the measuring cord. In other words, I haven't cheated people. I've not encroached on fields. I've not added to the pan of the scales. My business, like right in there, in their religious duties and in their business dealings, right in there, haven't engaged in a certain form of homosexual sex, and I haven't masturbated. That's in the Egyptian literature of the day. So the point is, the reason I'm sharing this, one, because it's kind of funny, but two, is because it's not new, and it's not unknown. The Israelites came out of Egypt, where they were slaves for 400 years. And God specifically told them, hey, all the things that the Egyptians did sexually, don't do those. In fact, let me run through the list of what not to do. And we have Leviticus 18 through 20. It was known. But yet the Bible never once mentions the actual act of self-stimulation to the point of orgasm, which is what masturbation is. Never mentions it. So it's not because it didn't have the vocabulary for it. Now, just keep that in mind, because again, this is not like, well, there you go. Go have fun, kids. No, not at all. The point is, when you're thinking through your sexual ethic, you have to say, now, how do I process this if the Bible doesn't specifically speak to it? Well, you're going to have to do sort of a roundabout approach, because the Bible speaks to every issue, even though it doesn't speak about every issue. So, but you may have to get there in a little circuitous path. So one thing that since the ancient times, like the rabbis and the medieval Christians, they've looked at Genesis 38, and they've looked at the story of Onan. And I've given it to you on page 27 of your textbook. Basically, you can read the story, but the verse that's really drives it home is verse 9. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, the child, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen, and that's the word seed in Hebrew, actually. We talked about that the first week. He spilled his seed on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death. God, this is Genesis 38, this is in the line of the time of Israel when it was a family before it was a nation, and this is in the line of Judah. This is Jesus' family history, by the way. These are the skeletons in his family's closet. The text says, oh, well, he spilled his seed on the ground, so God said that's wicked, and God struck him dead. Well, there you go. Masturbation, mortal sin. Why? Because it's spilling your seed on the ground. And God wants offspring to be produced. He said, be fruitful and multiply. So any of that is wasting of the seed, wasting of this vital fluids, and therefore God opposes it, and that's why it's wrong. And it's really wrong. It's not just a little wrong. It's like really wrong because God killed a guy for it. And to this day, the term onan and onanism is if you read the journals of religion and sexuality, onanism is the historic term for masturbation. That's what it's called, like in the 1800s and 1900s, when you can read it in American literature and journal articles and studies and everything. They'll refer to it as onanism. That's where it comes from, this chapter in Genesis about onan. So much so, in the Code of Jewish Law, this is cited in the Journal of Religion and Health, volume 16, number 3, 1977, Code of Jewish Law, which is an ultra-Orthodox, or like not every, Judaism is just as wide a spectrum as Christianity. So you have the equivalent of lapsed Catholics all the way to hyper-fundamentalists and everything in between within Judaism. But in a particular conservative and fundamentalist Orthodox Judaism, there's certain ways that they've interpreted the law, practices that they've adopted. And in one section it says, it is forbidden to cause in vain the effusion of semen. That's basically, it's forbidden to masturbate to the point of orgasm. And this crime is severer than any of the violations mentioned in the Torah. Those who commit fornication with their hands violate a grave prohibition, but they are also to be banned. Occasionally, as a punishment for this, children die while young. A man should be very careful to avoid hardening himself. In other words, don't even arouse yourself. Therefore, it is forbidden to sleep on one's back with his face upward. Why? Because in the night, you don't control your bodily functions. Blood flow goes wherever it wants, based on your dreams, based on just the temperature, whatever. And so you can't control your sex organs, and guys get erections at night all the time. But in this case, it was even like regulated down to, okay, so to avoid that, you can't sleep on your back, which I guess that was seen as adding to it. It is forbidden to hold the penis while urinating. In some Orthodox, like ultra-Orthodox Jewish bathrooms, guys, if you go in one and you see somebody with their pants around their knees or their ankles and holding up their shirt and just aiming, that's why. I mean, literally, that's why. From youngest age, you're taught, no, you don't touch that. That part of you. Don't play with it. Don't touch it. Don't explore it. Hands off. Well, it's nothing new. It goes all the way back, even in ancient Judaism. And in part is based on reading the story of Onan and seeing that God put him to death. Your child died while they were young? Oh, that's probably because they were touching themselves. Right there. Now, hear me. Not everybody that's Jewish believes this. In fact, the majority of Jewish people in the world and throughout history have not believed this. So don't get it twisted in that regard. But what it shows is throughout history, there's been this case. Here's some fun trivia. Anybody ever eaten a graham cracker or eaten cornflakes? Reverend Sylvester Graham and Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, I believe both were Seventh-day Adventists, but both in the 1800s, there was the belief that the ailments, sickness, even insanity was caused by the loss of vital fluids. Meaning, in particular for men, masturbation, for women, excessive sexual lubrication, all this kind, just the loss of those fluids. So, particularly, it was a problem seen among young boys. Like early, old Boy Scout manuals warned against masturbating. Like in the Boy Scouts handbook, said don't do it because it could lead to excessive blood flow to the brain and you could go crazy. Literally, not making that up. Well, these were beliefs that circulated, and so this was what drove the ethic for most Christians regarding masturbation, is just don't do it. The Pope had already said in 1050-something, Pope Leo Leo the Ninth in 1054 had said it's a mortal sin. Like there's venial sins and there's mortal sins in the Catholic Church, and murder, adultery, those are mortal sins. Venial sins are kind of like the lesser. Masturbation's a mortal sin. The Pope had already said it. So for Catholics, it was a done deal. Why? Because you're spilling seed, you're not procreating, et cetera, et cetera. But this is secular, or Christian culture, and even secular culture. It was seen as, so here, what does this have to do with graham crackers? Well, part of what was seen as keeping men, young men in particular, from having the urge to masturbate, the urge to experience sexual longings and lust, was a whole grain diet. It was believed that a healthy and whole grain diet would help stifle the urge to sinful lusts. So, Reverend Sylvester Graham invented a very healthy whole grain snack food that young boys and children and kids would want to eat. And he called it a graham cracker. And John Harvey Kellogg, doctor, invented this cereal, this whole grain healthy cereal that would contribute to a lessening of the sexual urge. We called them cornflakes. So the origin, and that's literally, that's true. You can look this up and Google all you want, but this is the case of how these two things in particular came about, to keep people from masturbating, because they believed that it had such detrimental effects, either morally or physically or psychologically. And some of the early studies, they'd note that people in insane asylums, like in padded rooms, masturbated way more than the general society. And Kinsey and others came along and said, time out. One, they're locked in a room. Two, they're insane. So what else is there to do if you're locked in a room by yourself? In other words, you don't get to see what people do in their private lives, but you can see what people do in an insane asylum. So that's not a very good correlation. It certainly doesn't show causation. But the notion was, for a long time that it's an issue of health and it's an issue of safety and everything. Then, aside from the Onan story, there's also the issue of Levitical purity. In Leviticus 15:16, it says, when a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather that has semen on it must be washed with water, and it will be unclean till evening. When a man lies with a woman and there is an emission of semen, both must bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. This is the closest verse in the Bible to talking about the specific issue of masturbation. And it's found in the Levitical purity section. And what it's saying is anytime there's an emission of semen, anytime there's a sexual act between husband and wife, in the bed, whatever, then that is going to result in a state of ritual impurity. And in terms of Leviticus, what it meant was you had to wait, you had to do a thing of purification, in this case, wash with water, before you could enter into God's assembly. You were just considered unclean. And that's not a moral thing. It wasn't like you're a sinner, because anytime a man and a woman had sex, there was an emission of semen. That's part of sex. So anytime a man and a woman had sex, they were ritually unclean until evening. In other words, there had to be this sense, and it's part of this intricate system where God was putting in place all of these things, all of these ways to show Israel the difference between what is common and what is holy. And common didn't always equal bad, it equaled common, unclean. Holy was in a separate realm. Not necessarily better. This had to do with like the kind of clothes you wore, and if you touched a dead body, a corpse, well, you had to do that if you were burying your family member. All of these things. So you could do stuff that would make you ritually unclean that there was nothing morally wrong with in Leviticus. And the thing with Onan, so we're going to get around to actual issue, but this is an example of how you have to work out this sexual ethic. I haven't even mentioned where we come down on the issue yet. But in getting there, you have to work through these things. You have to think about these things. In the Levitical purity, well, it's talking about purity and holiness in this section. When you study Leviticus and you read about the purity laws and you read about being unclean and what that means and what it doesn't mean, you see that it's clean and unclean in the Old Testament wasn't a sin issue. It was a holiness, a sanctification issue in terms of actually physically being pure or being common. Well, Onan, what about that one? That's pretty cut and dry. God killed him because he spilled his seed. No. The Onan story, if you read it, so Judah, look at verse 1. At the time, Judah left his brothers, went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her, he lay with her. She became pregnant, gave birth to a son. So Judah's first son. So Judah is one of Jacob's sons, one of Israel's sons, the head of the tribe of Judah. This is Jesus' great, all the way back granddad. He had a son, firstborn son named Ur. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Now, verse 6. Judah got a wife for his firstborn son, and her name was Tamar. So Judah, he's got his son. Judah's the head of the tribe. He's the head of the family. His firstborn son, the one who's going to carry on his family name, is So he finds a wife for named Tamar. They get married. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight. Doesn't say why, but he was really bad. So the Lord put him to death. Something in was so evil that God literally killed him. And just the fact that happens, and that happens in the New Testament too, with Ananias and Sapphira, so it's not just an Old Testament thing. But it was like, this is especially bad, and it's an especially important moment in history. And so God put him to death. So Judah said to Onan, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. This is weird. We don't have this. This is called levirate marriage. In the culture of the ancient Near East, it was common that if you did not have children or could not have children, that was the utmost important thing. That was you had to have children to pass on your inheritance, your tribal identity, your family name, all of it. Had to have a child. So if there was a couple and the husband died before they had children, then the wife, part of being a wife was you were granted the right to have children. And if you were of the firstborn, if you were married to the firstborn son, that meant that you were going to inherit everything, or a double portion at least. You were going to get the biggest inheritance if you were the firstborn. So the wife of the firstborn dies, no children. It was a custom, it was a law in ancient Near East society. There had to be someone to carry on that lineage. So it was the duty of the brother. There's argument about whether it would apply if he was married or not. Some say yes, some say no. But typically it would be an unmarried brother to take the wife, the widow, and to actually have a child through her or produce a child through her. And that child would not be the son of the brother, but would be considered the full, legally binding child, heir of the dead brother. That makes sense? Very convoluted, and it's really weird for us. But again, totally different cultures, time, setting, everything. So here's the situation. Firstborn, set to inherit everything when Judah dies. God puts him to death. He's married, God puts him to death. So now Tamar deserves, according to the rule and the ritual of the day and the law of the day, she deserves an heir that will carry on the family name and receive all of the inheritance. So he tells Onan, Judah tells his other son, do the duty of a levirate, do the duty of a brother-in-law, produce an offspring for your dead brother, so that the implied, or it's not even implied, it's just what's going to happen is, so that child, when it grows up, will get the double portion. However, Onan knows if he doesn't produce a child, that double portion and his portion goes to him. And Tamar, she's out of luck. She's just another widow. God really doesn't like when people abuse the widow and the orphan. And in this instance, Onan was doing the deed. Okay, I'll go have sex with her. And at the moment of ejaculation, which I know you just blushed when I said that, but at that moment, he pulled out, spilled his seed on the ground, early birth control, so that he would not impregnate her, so that she could not have the child, so that the family name couldn't carry on through her, and she would not be protected in her old age. And Onan would get all of the inheritance, and he would be the firstborn, and he would be the one through whom the lineage is passed on. What he did was wicked in the eyes of God, and so God put him to death. That what he did has almost nothing to do with the spilling of the seed. It has to do with the defrauding of a widow and the leaving her to a life of destitution. So all of that to say, that's the background when we're looking at that passage. When it comes to what does the Bible say about masturbation, the answer is nothing. Well, okay, so what do we think about it? Well, we need to think carefully. We need to look through. We know what the Bible says about lust. We know what the Bible says about inward desires to have, to objectify, to fantasize in a way that's not godly, in a way that's not honoring to the Lord, to desire to take advantage or to have what we can't have. We know those things. We know that humans are prone to selfishness, and we're prone to addiction, and we're prone to an inward focus of ourselves. So all of those things have to be factored in when it comes to issues of lust, and in particular issues of masturbation. And we have to look at it, and we have to realize that Christians have taken different views on it. Some have said, what they've all agreed on, this is the bottom line, what they've all agreed on is the actual act itself of stimulating yourself to orgasm to the point of ejaculation, or for a woman to the point of orgasm. That in and of itself, that action, which there is a word for in the ancient world, and there was a term, and they were known, that action is not wrong in and of itself. However, actions don't happen free of thoughts. And it's what's going on upstairs that determines what's going on downstairs is pleasing to God or not. And this is where Christians then offer advice that could be different depending on who you talk to. Here's where it gets into wrongness, is it becomes about you focusing inward, you focusing on yourself, my needs, my pleasures, my desires. Sex no longer has to do with the relational. It doesn't have to do with the relating to another human being. It doesn't have to do with the giving. It doesn't have to do with an honoring and serving another person. It's all about me. It becomes addictive, and pastorally, it can keep people in bondage. Absolutely true. Other Christians, though, they've noted, for some Christians, for instance, servicemen that are away from their wives for a year at a time and are faced with temptation and sexual temptation all around in terms of brothels or in terms of just pornography or in terms of illicit affairs now that the military is intergendered and everything. Like, they're surrounded by that. And so for them, that might be a much more healthy way to relieve their sexual tension, their sexual desires, than to burn with lust or than to give into another form of it. Christian sex therapists, yes, that's a thing. They deal with couples a lot who have sexual dysfunctions and sexual abuse history in their relationship. And so the actual act of sex is distorted because of either the abuse or something psychological that a person's experienced. And so they use and they've encouraged participatory masturbation with each other, it's stimulating yourself with your partner there, telling them this is what feels good, this is how I respond to pleasure, this is how I don't respond to pleasure, all of that kind of stuff. And so they've used that in the realm of sexual counseling as a valid option. James Dobson talks about, kids growing up, adolescents, they're growing up, they're exploring their bodies, they're realizing, wow, I didn't have hair there before, now it's there, my voice is deeper. For girls, what are these things growing on my chest? Like all of these changes that are happening, and they've talked about how part of that is this high percentage of young people growing up that engage in masturbation as part of the exploratory understanding of their sexuality. And Dobson, of all people, he is very conservative. He would say, look, here's what you look for. Things that are addictive, things that are abusive, if it's coupled with pornography use, if it's coupled with thinking that is objectifying, all of that, then, yeah, that could very well be something that could get easily into sexual immorality. However, if kids are coming from a very, very sexually repressed culture, a Catholic upbringing, or a fundamentalist hardcore upbringing, or just a sexually repressed secular upbringing, and they've just been taught that sex is bad, shame, 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 all this, then one act of masturbation can just send them into despair, like, I'm an awful person, I'm a rotten person, I'm so disgusting, I'm so filthy. And the cycle becomes a cycle of temptation, giving in, masturbation, and then a pit of condemnation afterwards. And it's just this downward spiral for people. And so, somewhere in all of that, what we as Christians have to think through is the ethic behind it all, is the underlying foundation. What does God want? What does He think about this? What does it look like in different contexts, different people? How does this relate to my kids who are asking me about this issue? How does this reflect in my mind when I was growing up, what I was taught about it? All of that is going to lead to different conclusions among Christians, particularly on this issue. And that's okay. I mean, this is, you have major doctrinal foundational issues, and then you have secondary issues where there can be disagreement, even passionate disagreement. And that's okay, as long as we remember there's primary and then there's secondary and then there's tertiary issues that are even less of importance, and there can even be more fellowship among disagreement. So on this issue of lust and masturbation and sexual fantasy, here's a quote by Collins. It's the first quote at the bottom of page 27. This is from Christian Counseling textbook. And this, I think, holds the balance very well. It says, when we consider the range of sexual behavior that's discussed in Scripture, homosexuality, bestiality, adultery, prostitution, rape, transsexuality, incest, it's difficult to think that masturbation is left out by accident. Clearly, masturbation does not seem to be one of God's great concerns. His word says more about the mistreatment of animals. We must be careful not to harshly condemn something that the Bible does not condemn. Any person who teaches or writes about masturbation is likely to be criticized. That's normal. That's okay. Here's the key. In the absence of clear biblical guidance on this issue, we're left with a variety of conflicting opinions, often given by sincere, compassionate counselors whose views we should understand and respect. Surely masturbation is a sin when it's accompanied by a lusting for sexual relationships that God forbids, when it masters us, there's a sermon wordplay for you, or when it hinders one's relationship with God. Open communication about masturbation helps to diffuse its destructive impact. And for most people, it will be replaced in time by a more fulfilling sexuality within marriage. But not for all people. For most people, not for all people. What Collins is getting at, and in his section he deals with it, and Richard Foster in Money, Sex, and Power, these are given in the resources recommended at the front of your book. They all of them write on this topic, and they both, the conclusions that they come to are, when it comes to the issue of masturbation, there are going to be good reasons to not do it. But there are also no clear biblical teaching that says, thou shalt not. So in light of that, what we have to do is hold that tension and say, look, the issue is the lust side of it, not the masturbation side of it, primarily. And that could come into play. But the foundational issue is what's going on up here. That will say a lot more about the sinfulness of the act than the actual physical act itself on this issue. Now, when it comes to the other types of sexual immorality, which we're about to look at after this break, the Bible does have stuff to say about it, and it does speak specifically to it. But the importance of the approach to it is we want to avoid both extremes. We want to avoid the extreme of legalism or asceticism, which is the early church practice of just denying the self, denying every pleasure. If something feels good, don't do it because that's keeping you from being holy. We want to avoid that extreme, but we also want to avoid the extreme that many Christians, particularly our denomination as Methodists, have fallen into, which is the opposite, which is libertinism. Do whatever feels good. It's just between you and the partner, and God's okay with it. It's not a big deal. Agree to disagree, do whatever feels right, whatever kind of love you want to express, we'll back that because it's holy and it's good and we want to affirm and we want to welcome. That's so not what Jesus taught, as we're going to see in just a minute. That is not at all what Jesus taught. So we got to hold that balance. How do you hold that balance? That's what you have to figure out as you develop your Christian sexual ethic. The quote by Deb Hirsch nails it, though. She says, when we are fearful as disciples or as a church, we begin thinking primarily about what we want to prevent and avoid rather than what we want to encourage and develop. In other words, we end up focusing on the wrong things. So what should guide a Christian sexual ethic is not, here's what you don't do. It should be, here's what we should be doing. And this issue or that issue or this may fall short of that in a number of different ways. So let's compare it to what we should be doing in order to see why we shouldn't be doing that. It's a completely top-down approach, and it's why we've structured this course the way we have, and we've started with 2 weeks of what we should do and what the celebration of sexuality is rather than what we shouldn't.